We'll go for about 45 or 50 minutes, and Pastor Packer was correct. I am abiding by the email I sent him 1,000,000 years ago about what we're working on today, tomorrow, and Friday, which are, let's say, an intensification or putting a magnifying glass on one of those three estates I talked about last year. Remember last year, however, that we rephrased the three estates as three fortresses, because estate means relatively little in America. It has to do with real estate, or what is left at the end of one's life. We talked about fortresses. We were under a certain amount of pressure, I think, that we all felt socially and politically last year that perhaps we don't feel this year. Perhaps. What we're drilling down on is the fortress, or the estate, if you will, if you are just wedded to tradition utterly. We're drilling down on the fortress or the estate of the church this year. The reason we're doing that is because it is in our hands, in a way that the state, rather obviously, is not in most cases, and in a way that the family obviously is, but about which I have spoken elsewhere, and just simply wanted to do this because I've never done it before. We're taking within that estate or fortress of the church the means of grace as our topic. We're doing that because when Luther especially talks about preachers, or when we think about the future of the church, we could do worse than to focus on the means by which the church is both created and sustained. Created, and especially that verb will be important for us today, tomorrow, and Friday, and sustained. Because it is the sustenance, the continued existence, the endurance, the perseverance of the church that is the thing about which I hear the most gripes, worries, and complaints. So we want to know not only how does it come into being, but how can it continue to be. Now we have three different locations, and with each location we're going to pair just a certain participle, so that we can think not only about where the church is sustained, but also how, by what activity. So if we take in this order pulpit, font, altar, we will also be talking about speaking and belonging and being. And we're going to do that because we want to stress today, tomorrow, and Friday that we are called within these estates and within this estate or fortress of the church to activity, not to despair or despondency, which is what is far more common, at least anecdotally for me, than activity. Despair I can find almost anywhere, especially if I have more than 20 minutes with somebody. And it's a despair, I think, driven by this fact that we can all remember a certain easier kind of a life. And so for that despair or for that despondency, I blame no one. And I don't roll my eyes on minute 21 when they start going into these kinds of things, or they start sounding angry or bitter or some other utterly unattractive trait or emotion that is not going to cause anyone to come into or remain in the church, but which seems to come natural to the Lord's Christians at this time in this country. I don't roll my eyes because I understand it. Imagine, if you can, that we all used to live in a really pleasant valley. And it's green there, and things grew easily there. Different kinds of trees, different kinds of crops. The farms were all neat. We all had something to do. We all had plenty going on. And therefore, we could really kind of obsess over who was a little bit of a better farmer than the other person. Or we could kind of obsess over, I have a nice stand of maples, and he just has pines. His soil's not as good as mine. And we can all remember that life. And at some point, like the people fleeing at God's judgment of Jerusalem from the city into the mountains, we went somewhere where it's harder for anything to grow. Higher up, fewer kinds of trees, different kinds of animals, not nearly so easy to grow the crops that we know how to grow. And some of us don't have farms at all anymore because the ground just is not conducive to farming. So we're all higher up, and first the valley was swept by fire, and we thought that we could rebuild after that. That is a certain moment of awareness of challenge, but also despair, in which I find many people. They don't think it's utterly gone. They can remember, for example, churches being, as a regular matter in many places, or maybe in all places in certain parts of the country, full. There's a wonderful memoir, wonderful for its humor and its insight, not wonderful in every regard, called That Reminds Me by a guy named Roy Harrisville. And he was a pastor in northeastern Iowa in the 1950s. And he went to what in the Missouri Synod would be called a circuit meeting. And there was a guy there, remember this is like 1953, there was a guy there complaining about how he was a pastor of a dying church in a dying town. And Harrisville says, we all knew the guy just never left his office. He says, this was the 1950s. Everybody went to church. He said, even my church was full. And we have, if not personal memories of those things, at least institutional memories of them. We can remember life in the valley, and it was nice. It was also easy at that time really to spend most of our time comparing ourselves to others. That would be the main burden of maybe our instruction in coming to the congregation. What's wrong with the Methodists? What's wrong with the Catholics? And we could do that because that was life. And we enjoyed at least informal, if not entire and formal and official, favor from the state and lots of other institutions. So we remember that. So if we're up on the mountainside and we don't know how to live now, and I don't know how to make a life up there, and we're looking down on the valley and it's not only been ravaged by fire, but now just flooded, I can't rebuild anything. There's no going back. It's underwater now. What should I do? I would suggest that a lot of Christians are at this point tempted to become something like a climate change scientist. So these are also, you will notice, I think not coincidentally, like climate change scientists, these are the Christians who get interviewed on NPR. And they do one of two things. Either they capitulate and say, I hated everything about life in the valley, and I utterly reject it now, and I will adapt to new living circumstances by rejecting what has been given me. So they will cover someone who is being utterly alternative, or they will cover someone who was once maybe demonstrably Christian in some ways and now is not. This is the fame of first Brian McLaren and then Rob Bell and then who knows who else. They'll do this as long as there are enough Christians around, politically speaking, for it to matter that there was someone who used to believe certain things and now does not. So rejection is one reaction. Another reaction is to become, I think, crazed by this difficulty in a way that is politically useful to your opponents. That is, you come off as wild, enraged, constantly angry, maybe at your own, maybe at non-Christians, maybe whatever. This is the political value of covering, for instance, a guy, maybe you know his name, maybe you don't, Greg Laurie, who is a pastor in eastern Tennessee, and he will make pronouncements about no Christian can be a Democrat or all Christians must vote for Trump or something, things that are utterly politically useful to his opponents, which is why he's been covered by places like CNN and NPR. So you will be, whether you utterly reject or whether you double down on things that don't really specifically have to do with Christ or his teachings, you will end up as some kind of a useful idiot. And at that point, I think you are tempted to become the equivalent of a climate change scientist. So here's what happens when it's hot in the United States today if you listen to NPR. A day where it's really hot, you can tune in and someone will say, it's getting hotter. We need to react in these very specific ways based on observation of weather in the last week or two. So you're going to take certain current adversities and say, this is how it's always going to be, and therefore we need to change everything all the time and capitulate however much in order to adapt to what I understand things always to be. Here's the Lutheran version of climate change science. You quote Luther in an offhanded way. Now, Luther has said practically anything you want him to talk about in any way. Okay? Because he's even worse than a podcaster in that at a certain point in his life, someone is recording practically everything he said. And that's really bad for anybody. I would find it totally miserable. And I sometimes wonder, why didn't he tell them just to go away? I just want to eat my burrito without somebody recording what I said between bites. But at a certain point, people are recording and they're writing and they're living in his house. So he says, in a fairly offhanded way, that the gospel is a passing rain shower. That's the English translation of the German word Platzregen, which is when in a certain place, maybe you can even see it, but it's not raining on you. The water is pelting down. And this is used to diagnose where the gospel has been and where it's going. And guess what? Whether Luther meant that to be about his nation forever and ever, he was wrong. His nation was blessed long after his death by his teachings. So when people use that and extrapolate that to present-day America and say it's hopeless, I do not think that climate change science is legitimate in the church any more than it is when they drag the guy onto NPR from University of whatever to tell me why everything about my life needs to change because today it was really hot in San Antonio, Texas. We don't want to be climate change scientists. We could be weather observers. Now that's a little humbler task. It's even something that normal people can do with rain gauges and temperature dials. As we observe the weather, we should not become despondent, but rather responsive. So both in this hour and then tomorrow and Friday, we want to talk about being responsive rather than despondent. We're starting with preaching, we're starting with the pulpit, we're starting with speaking because, to my mind, it is our chief crisis. Before it was our chief crisis, it was always talked about, historically, especially in our pastoral theologies, as the chief office of a pastor, understanding that preaching and teaching are not really distinct. The New Testament goes back and forth between the two verbs for the same activity all the time. So what is a pastor supposed to be doing? What is a congregation supposed to be centered around? Is it speculation about a future made uncertain by financial difficulties, by inflation, by lowering numbers, by whatever, and based on those prognostications, an understandable despair? The chief office of a pastor was always set forth as preaching. And we tend to limit that discussion to what happens on Sunday morning for 10 to 12 minutes. But this was not always the case. There was more preaching going on, and they thought that anytime the pastor was talking about God's word, he was preaching, he was teaching. Same thing. To my mind, it is our chief crisis because it is a way in which we are most obviously distinct from our forefathers who lived in different ways and did vastly different things than we did under what are, I think, historically provably vastly more difficult circumstances. Let me give you an example of that before I go into a little bit more diagnosis. An example of that is, for example, pretty much any church started almost anywhere outside of a major city in the Lutheran Church. Even in major cities, it was difficult in this way, but it's easier to see with rural churches. Difficulties entailed things such as, I actually have no idea how I will get where I am going. Or I have been called to go to a place at least once this winter that is excessively difficult to get to a group of people who may be something like 4 or 5 or 60 or 70. Whether it's heat or snow, or I'm walking, or the railroad broke down, or my horse died, or my carriage was overturned, as once happened to CFW Walther, in the snow, into a snowbank, they were still going. The question is, why would they do this? Why not succumb to despair? Because it wasn't pre-funded. The benefits package was unclear or, more often, non-existent. Why would they do this? I've read their letters, a shocking absence or minimum of even grumbling. Why would this be? And I think, as ungrateful children, we have taken their existence and what they did really for granted. Our discussions in the church are usually about the preservation of what is obviously shrinking, but was, when pretty much everybody in here was born, already there. In the case of any given congregation, any given place, the availability of the gospel and the sacraments rightly administered, it was probably there before we were born. Once it was not there, what drove anyone to go there? Because when Paul is considering the existence of the church, will it exist anywhere? Will it exist among a certain people? Will it exist? His question is running from Romans 9 through Romans 10, which we're about to talk about, into Romans 11. Will my own people, the Jewish people, so recalcitrant, so stubborn, stiff-necked, seemingly endlessly, will they believe? Two things differ so vastly about Paul from what I am likely to hear in listening to a discussion over coffee with a group of pastors. One is, he puts the problem on himself rather than on them. He does not treat his own people as a problem. He's not unrealistic about their resistance. But here's what he says instead of saying, they can go fly a kite. He says, I would be cut off from Christ. I would be myself anathema. If my damnation could mean their salvation, then that's what I want to do. His attitude toward his own nation, toward the lost, both Jew and Gentile, is to put the onus on himself, the preacher, rather than putting the onus on the hearer for his inability to comprehend the wonders contained in the Pauline church or the Lutheran church, if only people would just walk in the door. The onus is on himself. And then this too, which he says so clearly in chapter 10 of Romans, how will they hear without someone preaching? Seems like a dumb question. It's a very valid question. You may have found in your experience that Lutheranism, and not to speak just of Lutheranism, but Christianity is an increasingly unknown quantum to most Americans, especially under a certain age. They are unfamiliar, not just with how much better your doctrine of the sacraments is than the Calvinists, but they are also unfamiliar with the contention that Jesus' atonement avails for sin. However, soteriologically, your church maintains that that occurs. They don't know anything about Jesus Christ. Who's going to tell them? Paul's question is therefore a very valid question. So we're talking about preaching first, both in the pulpit and out first, because it is our chief difficulty, and indeed, how will they hear without someone preaching? Let's talk about a couple of questions about preaching, and then we'll talk about a couple of proposed solutions. The questions are for, the solutions are for. That's an organizational thing for you guys. We'll see if it's at all logically valid. The questions are, how widely are we supposed to preach? How much? What should we say? And how should we say it? To take them in order, here's what they mean. How widely is, what are we supposed to be doing? What should the church center around? It's a valid question because if we had an answer to it, it would actually clarify what it is that we're doing when we get together on any level. As a congregation, to talk about our work, as pastors, to talk about what we're doing in our congregations, as districts and synod, to talk about what we're doing as an entire church, it would clarify. It's why in former days, generally the discussion was about some doctrine or other, or some practical difficulty that the church was having or other, and that was the main burden of the meeting. Because if I know that, for instance, I'm supposed to be preaching the gospel to every creature, then that focuses me when I get up in the morning. It also puts the onus on me as the preacher rather than on the creature. So that I don't have to be, when I see that person looking obviously opposed. I mean, sometimes it's very easy now to see this person hates Jesus and his church. I don't have to be angry. I don't have to be despondent. I don't even have to be timid because he's being obvious. I could try being obvious myself. If I can answer the question of how much should I be preaching, how much should a congregation be devoted to spreading the teaching of Christ? And then I never really have a good answer to that because it's always more and more and more and more. And I can hear Paul saying things like, my constant anxiety on behalf of the churches. Then I guess my answer is I would like to live and breathe preaching. I would like to be as obsessive about it as people have down in the valley, remember those times, as they were about things like pro sports teams that obviously hate Christianity during Pride Month at the very least. I just don't have to care about a lot of things anymore. I can be a lot less distracted than I was before because I don't have the luxury. That's over. And that's kind of fine. It's actually easier to get things done when I am less distracted. I think we all know that. What should I be preaching? This depends, obviously, on the hearer or the audience. But I would say this, that we have spent a lot of time debating a lot of things in the Lutheran Church. And at this point, the preaching of them is no longer optional. So we've talked for a very long time, since before the 1970s, about how and why and to what degree and in what manner and in what progression within the sermon we should talk about God's law. Here's the problem. When the person comes into the church for the first time or encounters Christianity or a Christian pastor, most of all for the first time, his question may be, as it has been to me by various people, why do you say that there are only male and female? Because we are preaching, in a cultural sense, heresy from the get-go. This is not what they've heard. This is not how they understand things. This is not what much more socially and financially prestigious people told them to believe. Why are you, Lutheran? Why are you, Christian? Why are you, pastor, preaching heresy? Why do you say this? At that point, it doesn't really matter what my contribution to assorted online debates about the law and the gospel have been. What matters is whether I answer faithfully in accord with God's word. Here's why we say there's only male and female. We think creation is a good thing. We think the Creator is the only good one. So I have to preach. I don't really have an option anymore because the hearer and the audience are putting the question to me. I have to preach about the entire counsel of God rather than only those things which come easily or naturally to me based on my formation, my debates, and my obsessions prior to the present moment. And then how is a question of largely, I think, rhetoric. But it's a question even more than that, if you put it maybe more plainly. It's a question of excellence. Will I pursue within my vocation excellence in the things that vocation requires? I think that makes sense. When I don't want to be a bad father. I don't, when I cut the grass in the front yard, want to miss a whole big strip in the middle of the front yard so I have sort of a jungle sticking up somewhere between the front walk and the street. I want to do what I am doing well. But it's a question whether we are. I'll give you an example because it's something that I'll be talking about in a different venue next week, which is this idea that I don't have an explanation as to when and why we started, as a matter of course, reading our sermons. It's not something that I can find anyone ever taught anyone to do who wrote a book about it. I know anecdotally that there were people taught to read, quote, lest you say something wrong, but I don't know when we all started doing it. Similarly, I'm not sure when, especially as people began spending more time consuming lots of media, spending lots of time in school, the school day expanded. Our sermons went from 45 minutes in the morning, 45 minutes in the afternoon on the catechism, down to 10 in the morning when you're there once a month. So we have shrunk what we're saying as the world has massively expanded its reach into the lives of our people. And that how, both the how of doing it and how long to do what it is that you are doing, those have proven to be, I think, some of the most difficult topics to broach because we all have done it more or less or seen it done for sure. Those are the questions. The reason I didn't call them explicitly problems is because I hear too many people saying they have come into an awareness of problems or that they have, quote, concerns. To use those words is to affirm a kind of a weakness or a terror, especially about the future or the prospect of betterment, that I do not find in St. Paul even when he is in prison. He is bound, sure. We all have problems. Maybe we have a lot more problems than we did, or maybe more grievous problems, more obvious problems, simpler problems than we did in some bygone era. That could be. We are bound, but what does Paul say concerning the word that we preach? The word is not bound, not even once. It's not bound. And if we think either about preaching or about the future of the church in terms of our present limitations or our limited vision of what the future may bring, which could be limited by our experience or limited by all the threats looming on the horizon or limited by the jail cell we're sitting in, if we conceive of the church or her future in terms of present resources visible to human eyes, that is, if we walk by sight, then of course we will be despondent. Who wouldn't be? Even in the 1950s. Of course. Being responsive involves thinking not about concerns or problems, but about questions posed so that we may understand what answers should be given. It's not an awareness of problems that will actually bring about true confession of the name. Think about how Peter talks about this. He doesn't say, envision every difficulty you could run into and then figure out how you're going to respond. Give an answer for the hope that is within you. The hope's already there. Christ is being proclaimed. The hope is there. Give a defense on those grounds. Or Jesus says it in this way: do not worry what you will say. Do not worry. Climate change scientists are always consumed by worry, and they're here on the radio, on NPR, practically every afternoon to fill you with worry, so that you too may be despairing and also paralyzed. That's what they're for. Don't be a climate change scientist. So what are the answers? What are the solutions? We'll talk about these for a little bit longer than we talked about the questions, because I think there's so much room to get better. And it could be so much fun getting better. Let's do it in reverse order. So we just talked about how are we preaching. We said a little bit about rhetoric. We said a little bit about how long. So let's talk about preaching well, okay, as a technical matter. This would involve applying insights to the church that not only are available in ancient rhetoric, but are commonly practiced by everyone from TEDx speakers to Robin DiAngelo when she talks about white fragility. If you want to be convincing to people, don't read to them. If you want to be convincing to people, act as if not only are you intellectually convinced of something that I don't think Lutheran pastors generally have a difficulty with, that they are intellectually convinced, but that these things have something to do with other aspects of life as well. This was framed by a guy that talked a lot about preaching early on in our church's history, Reinhold Pieper, as when you address human beings, attending to their intellect, as well as their emotion, as well as their will. And that there are different ways to reach those parts of human beings, whether you realize it or not, and that whether you realize it or not, they're all being reached, even if you're only firing away at the intellect Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. Their will is still being moved somewhere. You just have no awareness of it. They're still feeling things. You just have no cognizance of what they are. Kind of a sad sermon review on what I think is roughly a 10-year pastorate so far, so we're going to anonymize both the 10-year listener and the 10-year pastor, was this: it's not that he's an unfaithful man, it's that he never gets me where I live. Now, maybe that has something to do with the way that he says things, or maybe that has to do with the vocabulary that he uses. Or maybe you could, if you wanted to, you could put the onus on the hearer and say he just doesn't appreciate the glory of that guy's preaching. But since the preachers in the room know that every hearer will have a slightly different complaint, and some of them will come through the handshake line and tell you something like, I loved when you said, and then they'll say something that you didn't say. Okay? I would rather put the onus on myself to be clearer, or more interesting, or more moving, or more whatever, than to put it on him. So techniques that are available historically in the whole discipline of rhetoric and are used by really any effective public speaker talking about anything, for better or for worse, really have to be applied in order for the pulpit to be renewed. And through the pulpit, the people of God. Also as they proclaim the praises of Christ, who called them out of darkness into his marvelous light. Because there is something eerie about how hearers or students catch on to not just what the preacher or the teacher says, but also how. And then they do it likewise. Not just the what, but also the how. If he is timid, they are timid. If he is obviously but silently despondent, they are too. If he is hopeful or joyful, so are they. They catch what he throws. That's the way it works. What about the what? It is incumbent on a preacher at any time to preach the whole counsel of God, not just in that he covers a sufficiently wide range of topics. That is true. That's part of the glory of the lectionary. That a wide range of things useful to God's people, not only needful, but also, in a very practical sense, Sunday after Sunday, useful, made useful by him, served up in a way useful and understandable. Not only that a wide range of topics is covered, but also the topics pertinent to them. This is why, especially when I talk exclusively to preachers, I'm not doing that now, and I think it's great, but when I talk exclusively to preachers, I talk about how God has not created league tables of preachers. Because you get head-to-head matchups between sports teams, you can tell who's better, and they're playing the same game in different ways, but the same game. Preachers are not playing the same game. One has a congregation full of people who are very much entangled with the world. Another has a congregation of people who are, at least maybe in an outward way, much more, let's say, orthodox, but hate the world. A world that is disgusting, but which God loves in just this way, that he sent Jesus Christ, his son, to die for it. That whosoever, including the eunuch, believes in him may not perish, but have everlasting life. We all have our own problems. I do not bear another person's sins. I bear my own. It has always been an easy matter. That's why Jesus makes such poignant reference to it in the Sermon on the Mount. And it was really easy in the life of the valley to talk about the specks, the splinters, the infinitesimal flakes from honest hard work that got in the eyes of the Wesleyans and the Catholics and the Baptists, and to ignore the logs in the Lutheran eye. It was easy, and maybe it was helpful to some people. It is now very often useless. How much more useless is it then for me to become a judge over the pulpit and the congregation and the works of another man? Why would I do that? Why not rather encourage? Who made me a judge and an expert on what should be said and done for the sake of those people of God gathered in front of, beneath that pulpit, that they may hear that message faithfully proclaimed? I am no judge. I merely suggest to him that he proclaim the whole counsel of God, not only widely, but with direct, clear application to their lives. That this is the very thing that the apostles themselves do, usually toward the end of their letters, sometimes throughout the letter, with Peter bringing up, for instance, persecution and how to respond to it throughout his first letter. Paul usually puts it somewhere closer to the end, maybe because people are often confused about this whole grace thing that he proclaims widely, and the super apostles like to come along behind him and screw up. So he has to be very clear and sometimes even organize whole parts of a letter by the misunderstandings that the people of God have about the truth of God. What should we say? We should say what we've always said. But it needs to be said, as every age needed it to be said, in a way that is clearly applicable to the lives of God's people. So we should talk about the workplace at least as much as we talk about the doctrinal differences between ourselves and some other denomination that barely exists in our area, but maybe the pastor grew up in it, so it's a hobby horse he rides every now and again. How much should we be saying this? I said earlier that we should be saying these things night and day. Here's what I mean by that. It is observable at different times in his ministry that Paul does the work of the ministry for free. This is especially the case where the difficulties are very many, where, let's say, the soil and the climate are very, very inhospitable to the gospel. So especially when he's among Greeks, he puts away certain things that are, we get them in English as rights, but it's the same word in Greek that we get in the New Testament elsewhere as power or authority. It's all just one word in English, right, power, authority. I'm sorry, it's one word in Greek. It's three different in English. He sets aside that power, authority, or right, if you will, that permission to get his living by the gospel at different times. That is telling because what that's promoting is the work over the reward for the work. I do not say this to congregations that simply are not paying their pastors. I say this to pastors, especially, and to the congregations that support them in all kinds of ways, to support that work. Because Paul doesn't ask himself, what is this problem? What is that problem? Okay, I'll stop. I think very often we do, not just with money, but with our own sense, about which we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about belonging tomorrow, our own sense of what is likely. And thinking about both the New Testament church as well as our own concrete forefathers in our own church's specific history, I am unimpressed by the obstacles in front of us. I really am. They are not nearly so obvious and clear and concrete as the idea that you can't feed your family. Sometimes that does happen today. It's happening more. Our church is, in many places, along with many other churches in America, in free fall, especially in our weakest areas. The church in which, for example, I met and married my wife, in which my first child was baptized, doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. If you realize it could go away, what would you do? Or if you realize that if you don't do something, nobody's going to, what would you do? I don't see those as problems. I see those as challenges. And the attitude that I find in New Testament Christianity is precisely this, that when presented with a challenge, they try rather than stepping back. They push ahead rather than retreating. That's how Paul gets himself into a lot of the difficulties you can see him in as he sort of tumbles from one mess to another throughout the narrative of the Acts of the Apostles. Because he's pushing ahead. And he looks stupid to people as he's doing it. Remember how, like his Lord, when he says that the little girl is not dead but sleeping, and it's the only time in the Gospels where anyone explicitly laughs, Paul says that we're not going to die from this horrible winter sea storm that we shouldn't have been in, and everyone thinks he's out of his mind. It's okay. Push forward. If you're wondering how much, more. If you're wondering if you should, then you should. If you're wondering if you could maybe try, I would encourage both pastors and hearers, congregations, to try. What's going to happen to you? The absolute worst thing that could possibly happen would be that no one in that place or with that group that you tried, absolutely no one, believes in Jesus Christ. Guess what? The worst is already the case. So it's either going to remain the absolute worst or it's going to get better. That's the way it works with the gospel. It brings life, and the nature of this life is always abundant. It's so abundant that when the prophets want to speak about how God's word will come also to his own people, miraculously, they can only talk about things like blossoms in the desert, because it is unsuspected and unexpected by man, and it is done by God. So how much? Why not more rain in the desert? Why not? It's not going to hurt a single thing. It can only make everything better. Then how far should we go with this? Retrenchment is the order of the day for a lot of Christians. I think that is the heart, and understandably so, but as I've talked about in other venues, not to my mind, actually faithfully so, that is the heart of the Benedict option. It is retrenchment. Go away. And if you go away, you will, and this is what I think specifically is so naive about it, you will hopefully be left alone. This is, in fact, not what has happened. We had a Obergefell 7 years ago, just let them marry. Now we have trans everything and more. You're not going to be left alone, so I wouldn't suggest that you try. And Christians are daunted by this, I think, partly because confrontation has not actually been, it's historical within Christianity broadly. It is not a traditional set of attitudes, assumptions, or practices within American Christianity of essentially any kind. So capitulation is very, very common. I would ask you to talk to somebody in his 20s who was raised Roman Catholic. He's probably resembles on the ground probably something more like a liberal Protestant than anything else because of what he was concretely taught. This is also the case increasingly, I found, with young evangelicals who are very invested in deconstruction, that is, tearing down Christianity in the name of usually some sort of intersectional theory of race, gender, and so forth. So capitulation is extremely common. It's also obviously easier than anything else. Why don't we do that? I think in some ways we have already because we weren't ready for this. A lot of us woke up to the fact that we lived somewhere other than the valley very rudely, and it was a shock. We didn't know. One day we're having kind of internecine theological debates, and the next day someone hates us because we like babies, or we don't think babies should be killed, or something that we thought was kind of obvious. And then we woke up, and maybe some of us were still asleep at that point, and then we woke up and they said, whatever, when you say boys can't be girls, there's something really the matter with you. You might be mentally ill. You might be mentally ill. And we woke up and we were shocked. So rage or capitulation, I find those very humanly understandable. I just don't find them productive. Here's what would be productive. Knowing what we believe and saying it anyway. That's in fact really all that's productive. I want to wrap up here by thinking in that way about the sower and the parable of the sower and how foolish he appears to be. Now that story is told in Matthew's gospel as a comfort to the disciples who have returned, in Matthew specifically, from their first sending in chapter 10, and they come back and they say, a lot of people don't listen to us like they used to, or something, I don't know. They didn't have all the same historical baggage that we do, thankfully for them. And the sower appears to be something of a fool because he's just throwing stuff around. Some of it where it can be trampled, and he's just going and he's throwing and he's not worrying about it. Or if you don't like the idea of the sower, think of it this way. Jesus calls them to be not bureaucrats, worried about the fact that the categories no longer apply and the funding is not what it once was, and the resources available seem to be diminishing inexorably, and their management is getting increasingly difficult, And people are worried around them and saying, maybe this won't survive, and maybe our department will get cut, and maybe we won't be here anymore, or maybe we'll have to close certain of our field offices. He did not call them to be bureaucrats, but to be fishers of men. So they go out, and they follow their own advice, and they fish all night, and they get nothing. And then they hear the voice coming from the shore, and he says, throw your net on the other side. 153. Everybody's shocked. The voice of the shepherd was guiding them. That's the worst that could happen. That we'll no longer have to worry about how our sense of things is going. All we'll have to worry about is following the shepherd's voice. Also to the high pastures, also to places where we've never been before, also to places way higher than we've ever gone, scary, with unfamiliar terrain, unfamiliar animals, unfamiliar everything. And the shepherd's voice is still sounding, even there too. Thank you. Let me take some questions. I think we have about 5 minutes. Is that right, Andy? Any questions? Yes, sir, in the back. Go ahead.
Great presentation. But I would like to spend 45 minutes preaching. How do I get there?
Yeah, one minute at a time each week until they don't know. It's like when some guys try to take the flags out of the church, they move it right here, and then next week it's here, and then it's next to my microphone, and then it's... I would say that the place to work on is not, first of all, obsessing over length, but over, do I know what I'm saying, and am I saying it in a way which is convincing? So the way that I started thinking about this was, I would come into the congregation where my first call was, and down the hill, we had this giant stadium that had been erected solely for lacrosse and soccer. How do the coaches get the kids to show up at 7 a.m. on Sunday? Something I never asked an acolyte to do. Never once did I need an acolyte to show up at 7 a.m. from a different state because there are plates in the parking lot, Connecticut, New Jersey. We're an hour and a half inside Pennsylvania, and people have come from Connecticut to play lacrosse at 7 o'clock in the morning. How did they do that? Because they acted like it mattered. So if I know what I'm saying, and I act like it matters, I can go 10 minutes, I can go 20, I can go an hour. Do I need to go an hour? Do I want to go an hour? Is that just an exercise in my vanity? That's a question to ask myself, okay? But I would say the focus should be on, do I know what I'm saying? Okay, so all the stuff about application especially. Do I know what I'm saying? Is it understandable? And then do I sound like I'm interested in saying it? Because at that point, the question of time becomes relatively unimportant for most people. They could stretch certain people to 2 hours, or they can't stand 3 more minutes of this. Yeah, good question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thinking about the fourth question, how are we preaching?
Yeah.
We're not used to listening to or even looking at excellent themes anymore, or maybe less and less.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how significant of a factor do you think it is, thinking back earlier in the life of the man who's standing in the pulpit and the Christian sitting in the pew, how significant of a factor it is that there is a de-emphasis in oration and rhetoric in schooling at younger ages. And if it is a significant factor, how high of a priority would you place reintroducing a strong emphasis on instruction, rhetoric, and oration in younger?
Yeah. I think especially at younger ages, because also if I want fathers and mothers to teach their children the faith, it would be really good if they can do it while making eye contact and not feel embarrassed by the subject matter. So how do I become more confident conveying this stuff, as well as things that do get very successfully conveyed in modern America, like sports team affiliations or, this kind of thing. Like, how does that work? So then I'm just reverse engineering. What I originally reverse engineered was just sports, because it's what I knew. So I wasn't raised in the church, but I was raised with sports affiliations, and also I played sports all the time. So I knew that there were people who really cared about something, and they successfully conveyed it to other people. So how do you do that? Because it's not specific to Christianity. Right? Yep. So yeah, any age as low as you can go with, look me in the eye and just tell me something clear about what you just read. That's great. Because that's helpful to the person to gain confidence in what he's doing, right? Maybe one more question before we turn into a hostage situation. Anybody? Yes, sir, go ahead.
With sports, there's a competitive aspect.
Yeah.
And there's also...
There is a theology too, go ahead.
For good and for ill. I'm going to talk about the good one, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just curious how that all fits in, because, I can think of a lot of differences in sports that don't maybe apply. People get really emotional about it.
Yeah, the competitive aspect in theology.
Part two, when you win,
This has to do, I think, maybe with the way we teach the faith, that sometimes we teach the faith as if the human being is at the center of everything, and everything is about him. If I teach it as Christ is ruling over all things for the good of his body, the church, I'm just one little soldier, then it's easier to see the competitive aspect is every time, for example, that a person is brought from darkness to light, the angels are rejoicing. Why don't I want to share in the angels' joy? The angels are rejoicing. I have seen Satan fall like lightning from heaven. He is cast out. You've got this coming up in the 3-year in Sunday's Gospel. So I'm thinking about this. I want to see this man be of a sound mind, restored, wanting to sit at the feet of Jesus. So I personally, it is competitive for me because I hate Satan and I want him destroyed, and I like to take people out of his house. I like to steal them through the preaching of the gospel. So I think it's very competitive, yeah. Any other, I think we're, I don't want it to be a hostage situation, so thanks everybody.